Today's latest update is Harry once said Meghan gets whatever she wants, but now that same man is looking at his own life and calling it a mistake, and that shift alone tells you everything about how far things have fallen.
This year, Meghan keeps getting called out by her exes as a liar who two-timed them.
She has now revealed that that information came direct from Meghan's ex-husband, Trevor Engelson, via an interview.
Trevor Engelson, the Hollywood producer who once shared a life and a last name with Meghan Markle, has spent years being conveniently written out of the royal story.
The silence didn't break with a headline. It cracked open with a voice from the past that refused to stay buried, and in that moment, everything carefully constructed around Meghan Markle began to fracture in ways no palace statement could contain. What started as a quiet podcast quickly turned into something far more dangerous. A timeline that didn't align. And once that question is raised, truth or illusion, there is no going back. Now let me ask you something right from the start. If a public image is built on perfection, what happens when a single inconsistency begins to unravel the entire story? Because that is exactly where this begins. Not in a courtroom, not in a royal hall, but inside a dim recording studio in Toronto, where Corey Vitiello sat down, removed his watch, and began speaking, not like a man seeking attention, but like someone who had already decided there was nothing left to lose. And that detail matters more than anything. Because people who have nothing to lose don't hold back. His words didn't come out as accusations. They came out as memories. Specific, measured, almost disturbingly calm. He didn't shout, he didn't exaggerate, he didn't dramatize. He simply described. And sometimes, description is far more powerful than accusation. He spoke about the years between 2014 and 2016, a period that, until now, had been accepted as a straightforward chapter in Meghan's life. A relationship, a transition, a move forward. But Corey didn't describe it that way. He described overlap. And that one word changes everything. Because according to him, while he was sharing a home, sharing meals, sharing a life, there were parallel movements happening in the background. Suitcases packed for London. Phone calls from unfamiliar UK numbers. Conversations that didn't happen in the open, but behind closed doors, behind running water, behind carefully constructed silence. Now pause here and think carefully. Why would someone need to hide conversations in their own home unless those conversations were never meant to be discovered? Because secrecy is never random. It always serves a purpose. And that purpose is what Corey slowly began to expose. He didn't rush. He layered it. He described how her phone would light up at night, how she would leave the room, how the tone of her voice would shift. Not casual, not relaxed, but tense, almost transactional. And suddenly, the image of a clean, linear love story began to feel incomplete. So let me ask you directly, do you believe relationships can overlap without intention? Or does overlap always imply something calculated? Because if Corey's version holds even a fraction of truth, then this wasn't coincidence. It was strategy. And that's where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because public narratives rely on simplicity, but real events are rarely simple. And when simplicity breaks, complexity takes over. But Corey didn't stop at emotional details. He introduced something far more unsettling. A moment. A physical moment that, according to him, he could not explain at the time, but now refuses to ignore. A rainy night. A black SUV. A man stepping out. Not introduced, not acknowledged, not explained. A document exchanged quickly, almost nervously, wrapped in something meant to conceal. And here's where it gets intense. Because when confronted, Corey claims the response wasn't explanation. It was deflection, emotion, reversal. A shift that turned suspicion into guilt. Now think about that pattern. When questions are met not with clarity but with emotional pressure, what does that usually indicate? Because this is where audience perception begins to split. Some will see misunderstanding. Others will see manipulation. And that divide is exactly what makes this story volatile. But here's the part that changed everything. Because this wasn't just heard by the public. It was heard inside the same home where the consequences would matter most. Because as the podcast began trending, the voice of Corey Vitiello didn't just reach listeners. It reached Prince Harry. And according to the timeline being discussed, that moment wasn't loud or explosive. It was quiet. A pause. A shift. The kind of silence that doesn't resolve anything, but starts questioning everything. Now let me ask you this. What happens when doubt doesn't come from outsiders, but begins inside the relationship itself? Because that is where things begin to destabilize. Not publicly, but internally. And internal doubt is far more dangerous than public criticism. Because it doesn't fade with headlines. It grows. It searches. It connects details that were previously ignored. And suddenly, small things don't feel small anymore. Late-night calls, unexplained trips, unanswered questions. They start forming a pattern. And once a pattern is seen, it cannot be unseen. But here's where the tension escalates even further. Because instead of addressing the situation directly, the response, at least publicly, didn't come through words. Came through imagery. A carefully staged appearance. A vulnerable walk. A narrative of pressure and emotional strain beginning to circulate almost immediately after the podcast gained traction. Now ask yourself, is that coincidence or control? Because timing in situations like this is never accidental. It is strategic. It is calculated. It is designed to shift focus. And sometimes it works. But sometimes it triggers something else. A counter-response. And that is exactly what happened next. Because Corey didn't retreat. He escalated. And what he introduced next wasn't just about relationships or timelines. It hinted at something deeper. Something older. Something that, if true, doesn't just challenge a narrative. It redefines it completely. And this is where the story takes a darker turn. Because when past events, especially ones buried for years, start resurfacing under pressure, they don't come back quietly. They come back with consequences. So now I want you to think about this carefully. If the past has been managed, controlled, and carefully presented for years, what happens when someone finally starts pulling at those threads? Because what comes next is no longer about perception. It's about exposure. And trust me, the next layer of this story doesn't just question the past. It threatens to change everything you thought you understood about it. The moment the first podcast episode ended, it didn't feel like a conclusion. It felt like a door being left slightly open. Just enough to let something far more dangerous slip through. Because what Corey Vitiello had done was not simply share a story. He had disrupted a narrative that had been carefully maintained for years around Meghan Markle. And once a narrative is disrupted, the public doesn't move on. It leans in. Now think about this carefully. Why do some stories fade within hours, while others begin to grow stronger the moment they are questioned? Because the strength of a story is not in how loudly it is told, but in how consistent it remains when challenged. And this one was starting to show cracks. Within hours, listeners began replaying sections of the podcast, not for entertainment, but for verification. Specific details started circulating: the suitcase, the late-night calls, the hidden conversations behind running water. Each detail, on its own, could be dismissed. But together, they formed a pattern. And patterns are difficult to ignore. Now let me ask you something. At what point does coincidence stop being coincidence and start becoming intention? Because that question is exactly what began to spread across discussions, forums, and media analysis. But here's where the situation escalated. Because instead of fading, Corey returned. Not with anger, not with noise, but with precision. His second podcast appearance didn't focus on events. It focused on behavior. And that shift changed everything. Because events can be debated, but behavior reveals patterns. He began describing something far more unsettling. Not what happened, but how it happened. He spoke about rehearsals in front of mirrors, about practicing emotional responses, about studying angles, expressions, timing. Now pause here and think. If emotion is rehearsed, can it still be trusted? because this is where public perception started to fracture. Up until this point, the story could still be interpreted in multiple ways. Misunderstanding, jealousy, miscommunication, those explanations were still available. But once behavior enters the conversation, intent enters with it. And intent is far harder to defend. According to Corey, this wasn't occasional, it was methodical. A process, a routine, a calculated approach to how emotions were presented, how reactions were delivered, how moments were shaped for impact. And suddenly, the narrative wasn't just about relationships anymore. It was about authenticity. Now ask yourself directly, do you believe public figures can completely separate their real emotions from their public presentation? Or is there always a line that eventually gets crossed? Because what Corey described suggested that line may not have just been crossed. It may have been intentionally erased. And that is where things began to spiral. Because the public doesn't react strongly to accusations alone, it reacts to contrast. And the contrast here was striking. On one side, a composed, calm voice describing calculated behavior. On the other, carefully timed public appearances projecting vulnerability. And when those two images collided, the effect was immediate. Clips began circulating. Comparisons were drawn. Moments that once felt genuine began to feel questioned. And once doubt enters perception, it spreads faster than any confirmation ever could. But here's where the story takes a sharper turn. Because Corey didn't stop at behavior. He introduced something else. Something far more dangerous than emotional inconsistency. He introduced a gap. A missing period. A segment of time that, according to him, did not align with the public timeline. And this is where things moved from uncomfortable to explosive. He referenced a specific age, 19. A period where records were unclear, where visibility was low, where documentation appeared limited. Now think about this. Why would a specific period of someone's life become the focus unless there was something about it that stood out? Because people don't question the past randomly. They question it when something doesn't fit. And once that question is raised, it invites investigation. It invites speculation. It invites attention. And attention, once focused, becomes difficult to redirect. Now let me ask you something important. Do you think the past can truly remain hidden in a world where information never fully disappears? Because if even fragments begin to surface, they don't just add to the story. They reshape it. And that is exactly what began to happen. The conversation shifted again. From relationships to records. From timelines to gaps. From perception to possibility. And this is where external voices began to enter the narrative. Because once a story reaches this level of attention, it doesn't stay contained. It expands. Different perspectives emerge. Different interpretations form. And sometimes, individuals connected to the past begin to speak. And when that happens, the story becomes something else entirely. Not controlled. Not predictable. But evolving. Now here's where it gets even more intense. Because while the public conversation was escalating, something equally important was happening behind the scenes. Inside the relationship that this story directly impacted. Because public pressure is one thing. Private doubt is another. And when those two forces meet, the result is rarely stable. So now ask yourself, what happens when questions raised outside begin to echo inside? Because that is where the real tension begins. Not in headlines, not in podcasts, but in silence. The kind of silence where answers are expected, but not given. The kind of silence where trust is tested, not through accusations, but through absence. And according to the unfolding situation, that silence was growing. Because as more details surfaced, one response remained noticeably restrained. Not defensive, not reactive, but observant. And that response came from Prince Harry. Now think about this carefully. When someone chooses silence instead of defense, what does that usually indicate? Because silence can mean many things. It can mean confidence. It can mean control. but it can also mean something far more complex. Evaluation. And if this situation had moved into a phase of evaluation, then what comes next is not reaction. It is decision. And decisions made in silence are often the most consequential, because they are not influenced by noise. They are shaped by clarity. Which brings us to the next stage of this unfolding story. Because what happens when private evaluation meets public pressure does not remain hidden for long. At some point, it surfaces. And when it does, it changes everything. So now I want you to consider this. If the narrative has already started to crack, and the past is beginning to be questioned, and silence is turning into evaluation, what do you think happens when proof, or something that looks like proof, enters the picture? Because that moment is where stories stop being controlled and start becoming irreversible. And trust me, that moment is closer than it seems. The shift didn't happen with another headline. It happened with silence. A silence that felt unnatural, stretched, and deliberate. As if something was being held back at the exact moment the world expected an explosion. And in that silence, the story surrounding Meghan Markle stopped being controlled and started becoming unpredictable. Because after the second wave of revelations from Corey Vidiello, everyone expected escalation. Another episode, another claim, another detail. But instead, nothing came. And that nothing became the most powerful move of all. Now think about this carefully. Why would someone who has already shaken a narrative suddenly choose silence at its most critical moment? Because silence, when used strategically, does something noise cannot. It creates pressure. It forces imagination. It allows the audience to fill in the gaps themselves. And those gaps often become more intense than any direct accusation. Within hours, speculation began to spiral. Not guided by new facts, but fueled by anticipation. People weren't just reacting anymore, they were waiting. Waiting for the next piece. Waiting for confirmation. Waiting for something that would either stabilize the narrative or completely break it. Now let me ask you something. Do you think uncertainty is more dangerous than accusation? Because accusation can be challenged. But uncertainty, it lingers. It grows. Connects dots that may not even exist. And that is exactly what began to happen. The conversation moved away from what had been said and toward what had not yet been revealed. That missing period Corey hinted at, the age, the sealed records, the unexplained gap, became the center of attention. And once attention locks onto a mystery, it doesn't let go. But here's where the story takes a deeper turn. Because while the public was speculating, something far more critical was unfolding in private. Inside the same environment where trust had once been assumed, it was now being tested. Because silence outside often reflects activity inside. And according to the unfolding narrative, Prince Harry did not respond with statements, defenses, or public appearances. He responded with distance. Now pause and think. When someone steps back instead of stepping forward, what does that usually mean? Because stepping back is not avoidance. It is observation. It is evaluation. It is the beginning of a process that does not rely on emotion, but on verification. And that changes everything. Because once a situation enters the phase of verification, it is no longer about perception. It becomes about evidence. And evidence, once found, cannot be reshaped. According to the sequence being discussed, this phase did not involve confrontation. It involved search. Quiet, methodical, and focused. Details began to matter. Dates began to align. Movements began to be reconsidered. And most importantly, patterns began to form. Now ask yourself, what happens when someone starts connecting past details with present revelations? Because that is where clarity begins. And clarity, once achieved, does not allow the narrative to return to its previous state. But here's where the tension escalates even further. Because as this internal process unfolded, external pressure did not slow down. It intensified. Discussions became sharper. Theories became more specific. And fragments, real or speculative, started circulating with greater confidence. The gap at 19. the references to sealed records, the suggestion of something intentionally hidden. Each element added weight. Each element increased urgency. Now think carefully. If multiple threads begin pointing toward the same unresolved area, does that strengthen the suspicion or distort it? Because this is the exact point where perception can shift rapidly, from curiosity to belief. And once belief forms, it becomes difficult to reverse. But the most critical moment in this phase wasn't public. It was private. Because while speculation grew, one thing became increasingly clear. There was no immediate denial, no direct counter, no visible attempt to shut the narrative down at its core. And that absence created its own impact. Now let me ask you something important. When a claim is serious enough to demand response, but no response comes, what does that signal to the audience? Because in high-stakes situations, silence is rarely neutral. It is interpreted, and interpretation often leans toward the most compelling explanation available, which means the narrative continues to move forward, even without confirmation. And that is exactly what happened. The story didn't pause. It advanced, driven by curiosity, sustained by uncertainty, amplified by silence. But here's where it becomes even more complex. Because silence affects both sides. It pressures the audience, and it pressures the individuals involved. And pressure, over time, forces action. Now consider this. If silence cannot be maintained indefinitely, what breaks it first? Truth or reaction? Because whichever comes first determines the direction of everything that follows. And at this stage of the story, that breaking point is approaching. Because when internal evaluation meets external escalation, the result is rarely contained. It spills. It surfaces. It becomes visible. Which brings us to the next phase. Because what happens when the search for answers produces something tangible changes the entire equation. No longer speculation. No longer theory. But something that can be pointed to. Something that can be shown. Something that forces a decision. So now I want you to think very carefully. If evidence, or something that appears to be evidence, enters this already volatile situation, what happens next? Does it resolve the narrative? Or does it ignite something even bigger? Because once that line is crossed, there is no return to uncertainty, only consequence. And what comes next may not just reshape perception. It may redefine everything that has been built so far. The moment uncertainty turns into something tangible, the entire story changes direction. Because until now, everything surrounding Meghan Markle had been built on fragments, statements, memories, interpretations, and silence. But the second something physical enters the picture, something that can be held, traced, verified, the narrative stops being flexible. It becomes fixed. And that is exactly where this phase begins. Because while the public was still circling around theories and unanswered questions, the situation behind closed doors was no longer operating on speculation. It had moved into something far more precise. Discovery. Now think about this carefully. What happens when suspicion is no longer enough, and someone decides to look for proof instead? Because that decision alone transforms everything. It shifts the focus from what might be true to what can be proven. And according to the unfolding sequence, that shift was already happening within the private space shared by Prince Harry. Not through confrontation, not through emotional reaction, but through methodical search. And that detail matters more than anything. Because when someone chooses to search quietly instead of react publicly, it usually means one thing. They are expecting to find something. Now ask yourself, would you start looking that deeply unless a part of you already believed there was something to find? Because that belief, even if unspoken, changes behavior. It sharpens attention. It slows decisions. It turns ordinary details into potential evidence. And that is where the tension intensifies. Because once a search begins, it rarely stops at the surface. It goes deeper, through spaces rarely touched, through items rarely questioned, through details that once felt insignificant, but now carry weight. And this is where the story takes a darker, more focused turn. Because according to the narrative progression, what was uncovered was not dramatic in appearance, but devastating in implication. Not a public document, not a headline, but objects, records, transactions, fragments that, when placed together, form something far more difficult to dismiss. Now pause and think. Why are small, specific details often more powerful than large, dramatic claims? Because they feel real. They feel grounded. They connect timelines in ways that general accusations cannot. And once those connections begin to align, the story stops being theoretical. It becomes structured. And structure leads to clarity. But here's where the situation becomes even more intense. Because clarity does not always bring resolution. Sometimes, it brings confrontation. Not loud, not public, but unavoidable. And that is where the dynamic between Prince Harry and Meghan Markle enters a completely different phase. Because once evidence, or something perceived as evidence, exists, silence no longer serves the same purpose. It no longer protects. It pressures. Now let me ask you something. When evidence challenges trust, what breaks first? The relationship or the narrative built around it? Because this is the exact point where both begin to destabilize. And the consequences are not just emotional. They are structural. Because relationships at this level are not isolated. They are connected to reputation, public perception, institutional alignment, and long-term legacy. And once those connections are affected, the impact spreads beyond individuals into systems. And that is exactly what begins to happen next. Because while this internal shift was unfolding, external forces were not standing still. The narrative had already gained momentum. Speculation had already reached critical levels. And now, the possibility of evidence, real or perceived, was adding a new layer of intensity. Which means the situation was no longer contained. It was expanding. Now think about this. If a story moves from speculation to potential proof, does it calm the situation or accelerate it? Because in most cases, it does the opposite of what people expect. It accelerates. It sharpens. It forces decisions. And those decisions, once made, cannot be easily reversed. But here's where another critical element enters the picture. Because while personal dynamics were shifting, institutional awareness was also increasing. And institutions do not respond the same way individuals do. They do not react emotionally. They assess risk. They evaluate impact. They act to protect continuity. And this is where figures like King Charles III and Prince William begin to matter in a different way. Not as participants in the narrative, but as stabilizers of the system surrounding it. Now ask yourself, when a situation threatens not just individuals but the perception of an entire institution, what becomes the priority? Truth or stability? Because sometimes those two are not aligned. And the choice between them defines the response. Which brings us to a critical turning point. Because once both personal and institutional pressures converge, the next phase is no longer optional. It is inevitable. Action. And action, when it finally happens, does not emerge gradually. It arrives decisively. It closes doors. It draws lines. It defines consequences. So now I want you to think carefully. If the search has already begun, if the evidence has started to form, and if both personal and institutional pressures are rising, what kind of action do you expect to come next? A quiet resolution, or a decisive shift that changes everything? Because whatever happens next will not just respond to the situation. It will define it. And once defined, it becomes part of a much larger story. A story that is no longer about isolated events, but about transformation. Which leads us directly into the final phase. Because the outcome of this situation will not just reflect what was discovered. It will reveal how far those involved are willing to go to protect what remains. And trust me, that final phase is where everything comes into focus. The final phase of a story like this never begins with noise. It begins with a decision. A decision that doesn't need to be announced, because its impact is visible in everything that follows. And in this case, that decision marked the point where everything surrounding Meghan Markle stopped being a narrative under pressure and became a situation under control. Because once the internal search reached its conclusion, once enough pieces had been gathered, aligned, and understood, the uncertainty that had driven the entire story simply ended. And what replaced it was something far more powerful: clarity. Now think about this carefully. What happens when doubt is no longer a question, but an answer? Because that is the exact moment where everything shifts. Not publicly at first, but structurally. And structure, as we've seen, is where real power operates. According to the unfolding sequence, the response that followed was not emotional, not reactive, and certainly not chaotic. It was precise, measured, almost surgical in its execution. Because when Prince Harry reached that point of clarity, he didn't respond with confrontation in the way the public might expect. He responded with action. Quiet action. Now let me ask you something. Why are the most decisive moments often the ones that happen without an audience? Because they are not performed. They are chosen. And once chosen, they do not need validation. They create their own outcome. And that outcome, according to the trajectory of the story, began to unfold away from cameras, away from statements, and away from speculation. Steps were taken. Access was restricted. Movement was controlled. And most importantly, separation began to form. Not just physical separation, but narrative separation. Because once trust is broken at that level, the shared story cannot continue in the same way. It either adapts, or it ends. And this is where the tension reaches its peak. Because the transition from shared narrative to individual consequence is never smooth. It is abrupt. It is definitive. It forces reality to replace perception. Now pause and think. Do you believe public image can survive once private truth shifts dramatically? Because history suggests something very clear. Image can be rebuilt, but only after it collapses. And collapse, in moments like this, is rarely loud. It is visible through absence, through change, through what no longer appears the way it once did. And that is exactly what began to emerge. The carefully maintained image, the consistency, the control, the alignment, started to fragment. Not all at once, but enough to be noticed, enough to be questioned, enough to signal that something fundamental had changed. But here's where the story expands beyond individuals. Because this was never just about one person or one relationship. It was connected to something much larger. An institution, a system, a legacy that cannot afford instability. And that is where figures like King Charles III and Prince William enter the final stage of this narrative. Not as observers, but as decision-makers. Because when a situation begins to affect the perception of the monarchy itself, the response cannot remain passive. It must become protective. Now ask yourself, when the stability of an institution is at risk, what becomes more important? Loyalty or preservation? Because in systems like this, preservation always comes first. And that means difficult decisions are made. Quietly, efficiently, without explanation. Because explanation is not required when the objective is control. And control, at this stage, was fully re-established. Which brings us to the most revealing part of this entire story. Because while the public may focus on moments, the podcast, the revelations, the speculation, the real outcome is defined by what remains after everything settles. And what remains here is a completely altered landscape. Relationships redefined. Narratives separated. Boundaries reinforced. And a system that has once again asserted its ability to protect itself. Now let me ask you one final question. Do you think this was the end of a story? Or the beginning of a transformation that will continue to unfold in ways we have not yet seen? Because if you look closely, the answer is already there. Moments like this do not simply conclude. They echo. They influence future decisions. They reshape perception in ways that extend far beyond the original event. And most importantly, they leave a mark. A mark that cannot be erased, only managed. And that is exactly what has happened here. The story may feel complete, but its impact is just beginning. Because once a narrative is broken and rebuilt, it never returns to its original form. It evolves. And that evolution is what we will continue to watch. So if you followed this journey closely, if you've seen how a single voice can disrupt an entire narrative, how silence can be more powerful than statements, and how structure ultimately determines outcome, then you already understand something most people miss. These stories are not just about individuals. They are about systems, power, control, and the moments where all three collide. If you want more deep, high-retention breakdowns like this, where we go beyond headlines and uncover the structure behind the story, make sure you stay connected. Subscribe, stay engaged, and keep watching closely. Because the next story might not just reveal what's happening, it might reveal why it was allowed to happen in the first place.